No, only thing I would like to add here,
Conference is now being recorded.
yeah. See, originally under the AQR program, we had given the roadmap which runs up to March 2017. And I think we had indicated several times that is a very clearly laid out path, and there won't be a need to have a relook at it again and again. As Governor mentioned, banks have moved on that path as it was laid out. Some of them have preferred to take an early call and probably took some major percentage of it in December and March quarter. Having said that, sometimes we get the question because ratios are picked up in isolation. Sometimes we talk about the stressed assets as a total, and sometimes we pick up GNPA as a percentage and say there is an elevation and it is not what was indicated. I think what is important to look at it that during these 2 quarters and the June quarters where the results have come, there is a substantial migration between the categories. So maybe some of the assets which were earlier indicated in the overall stressed asset bucket might have moved from restructuring to GNPA percentage, but it was something which was very well, anticipated. Overall, if you look at it, the overall percentage of stressed assets, there is no significant elevation. The pace of generation of new NPA, there is a clear deceleration. And so I think that is what would be the roadmap. Of course, the provisioning requirement would continue to enhance as the in remaining 3 quarters, some more assets do come within the bracket, and also the aging takes effect. As far as the various measures, Governor has already mentioned. And I think the overall movement of the banks in that direction is getting more sure-footed, if not that any definite resolution is on the card. But I think the clarity is much greater than what it was when we embarked on this path.
Fourth question, Lata, please.
It's underway. You'll hear shortly.
Okay.
Review has been done. We're now working on what measures.
Yeah. One question per person, please. Anurag.
Sir, this is Anurag from Z Business, sir. सर जिस तरह से आपने कहा कि खाने पीने की महंगाई काफ़ी ज़्यादा थी जुलाई में, इस वजह से रेट कट पॉसिबल नहीं हो पाया और आगे अच्छी संकेत दिख रहे हैं, लेकिन सर क्या माने जो भी रेट कट होगा वो FY17 में ही हो सकता है, क्योंकि FY18 में तो GST लागू हो जाएगा, GST लागू होने के बाद हमेशा महंगाई बढ़ती है, तो जो भी रेट कट की संभावना है वो अगले 6-8 महीने में ही है। और सर एक चीज़ और आपसे समझना चाहूँगा, अभी आपने कहा कि 150 बेसिस पॉइंट जो आपने रेट कट किया उसका इतना पास ऑन नहीं हुआ, तो सर आप कहेंगे आप खुश नहीं हैं, संतुष्ट नहीं है उस पास ऑन की वजह से?
Okay, 2 questions. On the first question on whether there is a time before which it will become impossible to do rate cuts, I don't really think one can argue in such a way that there is future inflation anticipated, therefore it will become impossible to do a rate cut. Your rate cut is done taking into account the time path of inflation. If you think there's going to be more inflation in the future, you won't cut rates now. That said, I don't think it is wise to assume that GST implementation will necessarily increase inflation. And second, that whatever inflation that happens, whether it will be long-term or short-term, is something to think about. That it is quite possible it could be a one-time adjustment of prices even if there is inflation. And similarly with if some of the conditions of the pay commission, the allowances, for example, housing allowance, that also will be something that's passed through into prices over time, but it may be a one-time effect on inflation rather than a permanent effect. What as monetary policy, the monetary policy setters have to be aware of is whether this feeds into more generalized inflation. And that is what they have to worry about. That is something the RBI will be worrying about going forward. On the second question was, I'm sorry, transmission. Yes, I mean, look, we would be happier if there was more transmission. I do understand some of the difficulties the banks have. And my sense is that as this process of cleanup happens, and as the economy recovers and credit demand also picks up, you will see more possibility of transmission.
Supriya, one question, please.
This is 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much. Sir, I wanted to follow up on this inflation bit. You sound worried about inflation. You are flagging off concerns, but somehow your policy doesn't talk about the GST inflation impact at all, even though you're talking about the 7th pay panel and you're talking about household expectations rising in turn. So that's question number 1. I will just follow up on NPAs for a bit because you've given a long answer and Mr. Mundra did exemplify that further, but are you satisfied with what's that done, and do you worry there could be some amount of backtracking? After you're gone, you've decided to kill the cruel joy that you spoke about in the last policy, but I'm just taking a liberty to ask you that second question.
Okay. Now I forget the first question. GST, look, it's premature to talk about the inflationary impact of GST when we don't know what the rates will be. As the rates are set, one can get a better estimate. And as I said, the experience of other countries, for example, Malaysia, has been that the inflationary impact, in their case, there was an inflationary impact, but it was short-lived. What is important is we have to see that the price adjustment, if there is one, conditional on GST coming in, doesn't become generalized inflation. A lot depends on which prices go up, which prices come down. Some prices may also come down. And are these salient prices, not so salient prices? So I think it's premature at this point. The RBI currently is focused on meeting the glide path target of 5% by March 2017. We don't visualize GST obviously coming in before April 2017 at the earliest, and therefore this is outside, in a sense, the short-term horizon for which we are planning, but it has to factor into the medium-term horizon. That said, before we know the numbers, it is premature to talk about it. Let me just ask Urjit to add to that first answer, and then I'll talk about that.
About 55% of the CPI basket will not be impacted by the GST. Secondly, as the governor said, the effective rate is going to be important. But remember that one benefit of the GST is that the cascading disappears. So you might actually get effective tax rates on many goods and services to come down. And usually as the base expands, you don't need to have a tax rate which is as high as would be required. So the inflationary impact, firstly, it could just be one time. Secondly, to the extent that such a large part of the CPI basket is already out of it, I think the durable impact on it is likely to be limited. But it remains to be seen, and the full effects of this will be only felt, if at all, possibly in the second half of the next financial year as we go forward.
On the NPAs, first let me introduce to you our new Deputy Governor in charge of regulation, Mr. Viswanathan. So as you can see, Mr. Viswanathan will be essentially holding the fort on that issue along with Mr. Mundra. And I don't see why that should be assumed that there would be any backtracking. I think the path is clear. There has been substantial cooperation all along the way between the government and the RBI on this. The banks know what needs to be done. The promoters know what needs to be done. And therefore, I would think that, it's a process of doing it as opposed to backtracking.
No, I would just like to add that a policy becomes very successful when those who are impacted by the policy also start firmly believing it and start practicing it on their own. And as both of us mentioned, that banks themselves have now quite proactively engaged with this. So I think it will be a virtuous cycle which should continue.
Shishir.
गवर्नर राजन, नमस्कार। मेरा नाम शिशिर है, मैं एबीपी न्यूज़ से हूँ। दो सवाल के परंपरा को आगे बढ़ाता हूँ मैं। मेरा
नहीं, you guys
नहीं,
don't
इसी को
follow
दो
my
हिस्से में।
instruction. I like to instruct the
क्योंकि
governor.
आपने कहा है कि जीएसटी लागू करना टाइम के हिसाब से जो टाइम दिया गया है उसके हिसाब से बहुत चैलेंजिंग है, तो सबसे बड़ा चैलेंज आपके हिसाब से क्या है अगर 1 अप्रैल 2017 से लागू करना है? और दूसरा सवाल कि तमाम आंकड़े आ रहे हैं कि जीएसटी लागू होने के बाद जीडीपी 1%, 1.5%, 2% बढ़ सकता है, आपका असेसमेंट क्या है?
Yeah. So first on the challenges, obviously this is an enormous undertaking, and such an enormous undertaking will require efficient implementation from all sides. Also, there are, as you know, some legislative sort of requirements. The states have to pass it, at least half the states, and so that will take some time. But broadly speaking, the government is confident of doing it. I don't see any reason to doubt it, but it is a challenging task. On the issue of how much this will add to GDP, I think this is more guesswork than I think other countries that have managed to do this have seen, as Dr. Patel said, both an improvement in revenues, but also by unifying the market in the country. You both reduce the transaction costs of transport, which is very important, the time, the wastage, etc. But you also increase efficiency because now you can produce anywhere for anywhere. You don't have to locate because you want to produce for that particular territory or whatever. So those kinds of benefits of a unified market may be harder to calculate, but may be significant in the longer run. So 2% is not a big number. I would think that should be achievable. Let us see.